My name is Taylin Spurlock. I'm a second-year master's student in the Department of Geography and Planning at Appalachian State University, and my co-authors on this paper are Drs. Maggie Sugg, Jennifer Runkle, and Dennis Gagne. So Maggie Sugg and Dennis Gagne are with Appalachian State, and then Jennifer Runkle is at the NC Climate Institute. And my whole thesis work is on examining hurricane exposure of neonatal outcomes using a case study of Hurricane Isabel from 2003. Perfect, so to get started, I just wanted to show you guys a satellite imagery photo, because as a geographer, we love imagery, we love maps. And this just shows you how large Hurricane Isabel actually was. It was only a Category 2 when it made landfall between Cape Lookout and Cape Hatteras, but just to show you how big the wind and rain bands really were. So here's the track. Hurricane Isabel made landfall on September 18, 2003, between Cape Lookout and Cape Hatteras of the Outer Banks. And it wasn't a major hurricane by any way, shape, or form. It actually only brought 1.5 to 1 foot and above normal of storm surges, especially along the coast. So to examine this relationship, I decided to really hone in on two research questions. Does hurricane exposure, especially prenatal exposure, impact neonatal outcomes, specifically low birth weight and preterm birth? And if there is a change in spatial patterns pre and post Hurricane Isabel? So to quantify hurricane exposure, we really had to dig into this relationship. And my cohort ended up being around 147,000 women in North Carolina that gave birth the 9 months after Hurricane Isabel and exactly a year before between those same dates. So the mothers were between 20 and 39 years of age, because anything less than that, you're going to have complications. Anything more than that, you're also at a higher risk for more complications. You had to have at least 20 weeks of completed gestation, because we don't want to have any miscarriages in our data set. We only had to have live births. They had to have given birth between 9/18, which is the date of landfall, and then June 18th in 2004, which is exactly 9 months later. And to examine hurricane exposure, we decided to look at 3 different spatial buffers. So we have 30 kilometers, 60 kilometers, and 100 kilometers from the storm track. So I did a lot of statistical analysis. As anyone who's done research, you may know, I use RStudio, so I have thousands of lines of code on this. But a couple of the methods that got on my poster were chi-squared tests, which are just examining populations to make sure that our sample sizes would stay relatively similar, logistic regressions, and then I used the difference in difference analysis, which takes 2 populations. So let's say we have a parallel trend of 2 populations, and then right here is the exposure, and one goes up and one stays the same. So difference in difference analyzes that change of the differences between the exposures, so that way we can quantify the exposure. I only have time to go over Model 3. This is our best fit model. So we use coarsened exact match data based on the mother's age, race, and educational attainment. Our data set is a prospective birth cohort funded through the Notre Dame's Children's Environmental Health Institute. Since we didn't have a proxy, or I guess a variable that examined mother's income, we decided to use educational attainment, because as the higher education you have, you're more likely you are to have a higher income level. So for Model 3, we found significant results at the 30 and 100 kilometer buffers. So if you were really close to the storm track or 100 kilometers away from it, you had a less likely to experience adverse birth outcomes. So we found a negative association, which we were not really expecting to find. And then for preterm birth at the 30 kilometers, so the closest to the storm track, you also are less likely to experience low birth weight or preterm birth. And then since I'm a geographer at my core, I also did a spatial analysis, and I used the Queen Spatial Weights Matrix and the local Moran's I, which just analyzes hotspots. So here are the maps of pre and post Isabel. As you guys can see, I have it on my poster back there because this might be kind of hard to see. There's a change in clustering pre and post, so this is low birth weight and preterm birth outcomes. The highlighted on the pre is you have a high, so that means you have high variables of low birth weight and preterm cases. And it's surrounded by low high, so that means there's a statistical outlier right there in the storm track. And then post Isabel, we have a cluster of low outlier, or low spatial analysis. So you have low birth weight outcomes and low preterm birth, so you're less likely to have these adverse neonatal outcomes in these two track areas. So while we did find a negative conclusion, we kind of hypothesized that this could be to the community coming together, and also that this was a non-major hurricane. With Category 2, you're not really expected to have that much. You don't have to evacuate. The flooding is not going to be as severe. So we expect a community coming together, kind of like COVID and mental health. During COVID, mental health actually increased. People were happier because more community resilience was coming. And so that's kind of what we're hypothesizing with this. Further research is going to explore Hurricane Irene, which made landfall in 2011 as a Category 3, as well as a cluster of 3 hurricanes that made landfall in September of 2004 in western North Carolina that all ended up being Category 1 or 2 because research has not focused on anything less than Category 3. Actually, most of the research is focused on Hurricane Charlie, which was a Category 4, or Hurricane Katrina, which is Category 3, but obviously Katrina had a lot more issues than that. And that is really all I have. My poster will be in the back if you guys have any questions. Also, feel free to email me at spurlocktj@appstate.edu. Actually, I get to introduce Sarah Ulrich. She is also an App State Geography Master's student, also in her first year.
All right. Hello, everybody. So I'm just going to hop right into it. I don't have that much time, and I have a lot of exciting things that I would like to cover. So the research that I have been working on is titled Spatial Analysis of Maternal Mental Health Conditions in North Carolina, a Retrospective Birth Cohort Study. And this is research that I have done along with Dr. Margaret Sugg, Dr. Jennifer Runkle, and Sophie Ryan. So if you'll scroll up to this graph, I just want to start off with this. The CDC recently put out a report showing that the maternal mortality rate in the United States has been increasing drastically each year for pretty much the last 2 decades. And honestly, since 2018, the maternal mortality rate has pretty much doubled in the United States. And of particular note from this graph, Black women in particular are 3 times more likely to die in childbirth than white women, and also have a maternal mortality rate approaching 70%. And something that really sticks out to me from that CDC report is that 84% of these pregnancy-related deaths are preventable, which I think is absolutely unacceptable in the United States. And a big part of these deaths is maternal mental health conditions. And while awareness around maternal mental health conditions has been increasing, really the factors that feed into maternal mental health conditions are quite understudied. And so that's what I wanted to do with my research, is really look into where maternal mental health exists spatially, and community and individual level factors that contribute to those conditions. So I won't get too deep into my methods because again, I don't have that much time, but I did use SATscan, which is a software that identifies geographic hotspots. And I use this to look at 3 different maternal mental health conditions in North Carolina using a very large set of hospital data among all recorded hospital births in North Carolina from 2016 to 2019. And so what I found, and this is the first condition, this is perinatal and postpartum mood and anxiety disorders. And from my spatial analysis, I've identified clusters of these conditions across North Carolina. This map at the top shows areas in North Carolina where there's a statistically significant clustering of PMAD. And what you'll see as we go through these 3 maps, and you can scroll on to the next one. Oh, sorry, those are my objectives, but I already went over those. You can go to the next one too. Is these clusters across all 3 of my conditions, the others being severe mental illness and maternal mental disorders of pregnancy, They all cluster in very similar regions across the state, with the notable exception of eastern North Carolina. I think this is particularly significant when we think about who lives in eastern North Carolina. Eastern North Carolina has a higher Black population compared to the rest of the state, and so a lack of clustering in this region is not necessarily a result of not having maternal mental health conditions in this region, but it might be a result of race-based differences in how we identify and treat maternal mental health conditions. So after I did my spatial analysis of where maternal mental health conditions are located in North Carolina, we also wanted to compare the location of these clusters to external community and built environment variables. The four main ones that I focused on were racial segregation, income segregation, access to green space, and rurality, so living in a rural or an urban area. And I'm a geographer, so a lot of my results are presented in the form of maps. And I just want to get into them really quickly. If you'll scroll down to the next couple slides, you can go on. So to measure racial and economic segregation, I used the index of concentration at the extremes. Super happy to talk about my methodology later. I won't get too deep into it. But one of my main results after running a statistical analysis was that living in a neighborhood that is predominantly low income is associated with a higher risk of also residing in a maternal mental health cluster. And the same effect was observed for living in a predominantly Black or a predominantly mixed race neighborhood, and that's in comparison to higher income neighborhoods and predominantly white neighborhoods. And if you'll scroll onto the next map, I mentioned that I looked at living in a rural or an urban location. A very interesting result that I found was that living in an urban location was associated with a higher risk of also living in one of those maternal mental health clusters. But if you remember where my clusters were located, they tend to be located in mid-sized cities, so Greensboro, Asheville, Fayetteville, Wilmington, and not so much Charlotte and Raleigh. And there's a lot of reasons why that may be, and a lot of it has to do with just a social public amenity network that might not be as developed in those mid-sized urban areas compared to your larger urban areas. And then one of my last results that I want to touch on, if you'll scroll to the next map, is really interesting, and it's access to green space. And there's a lot of literature that confirms a positive relationship between green space and mental health outcomes. There's not a lot of literature that looks specifically at maternal mental health outcomes. And an interesting result from my analysis was living in an area of lower green space relative to the rest of the state, to the rest of North Carolina, was actually associated with a lower risk of living in a cluster. And I think this speaks to the importance of green space accessibility when we think about how the mere presence of green space is not enough to necessarily facilitate a positive impact on mental health. And I don't have a slide for this, but another result that was significant in my research was when looking at instances of severe mental illness, which is the most severe and the least prevalent of the three mental health outcomes I studied. We found a higher incidence of this condition among Black and Hispanic women compared to the other two conditions, which I think is also very notable. And in the interest of time, I'm going to wrap up quickly. I'm going to break one of the big PowerPoint rules and just show you guys a block of text, but I think it summarizes this very nicely, not nicely, but in reference to maternal mortality. These women died because pregnancy is a totalizing physical experience, one that challenges and changes the body in profound, irreversible ways that are kept from public discussion by ignorance and taboo, and they died because they lived in a country where medicine is rationed and unaffordable, where women's health care has been starved of both talent and investment, and where disregard for both public health and for female pain has left vast swaths of pregnant people vulnerable in ways that reflect more on the values of their society than on the fragility of their bodies. And that was from an article in The Guardian. But yeah, feel free to come and talk to me later. I'll be around all day, and thank you very much.